Welcome back to the garden. Today I want to talk about ways to maximize and increase your harvest in a small space or temporary garden. So when I started out gardening, my very first garden was 2 straw bales, and I had done a lot of research about the straw bale gardening trend, and I knew that my place was temporary and I couldn't put in any raised beds and I didn't want to disturb the grass, and so I put 2 bales of straw on a concrete pad behind our house, and I did my best to grow peppers, squash, tomatoes, and to be honest, not much happened. Then the next year that I gardened, we had a space that we could use as a big raised bed, and it was full of weeds really, and rocks. And so I spent a couple days digging everything out, adding compost to the top, and planting my garden. And little did I know, it was in a just partially shady area, and I tried really hard that summer. I wanted to grow squash and tomatoes and peppers, and despite all my efforts, I only harvested a couple squash and a couple cherry tomatoes. But then we moved to this house, which we've lived here for 2 years, and it's a property that we rent. At this house, we've built 3 temporary raised beds, and I also have a tower planter, a green stalk tower planter, and a couple pots for my garden. And to be honest, it's been difficult. Every house that we've lived in, we've known has been temporary, and there hasn't been a long-term gardening solution. And my garden has never been a Pinterest-worthy garden. It's been makeshift with what we have and trying to reuse, and for a long time that really made me disappointed. I felt like my garden was never going to be productive and successful and even worth it in a temporary space. But now that we've unexpectedly been here for 2 years, I'm really thankful for the effort and the work that I've put in, even though we know this isn't our forever home. So a couple things that have really helped me be successful in my temporary and small space gardening situation. The first one is perspective and effort, and really doing the best with what you have. Taking the time to learn and grow as a gardener in a temporary space will really help you when you get to your more long-term space. So working really hard to put in the effort, to have a good attitude, to work hard to grow, even when it's not a permanent situation, is how you're going to have the most harvest out of your small space. Something else that's helped me a lot is growing vertically. So I mentioned my green stalk tower planter, and I have that loaded up with strawberries and flowers and miniature tomatoes. And that has been really successful for me because it's something I can move from house to house. I don't dump out the soil, I just take it apart to move it, and I can have those plants more long term. Another way I'd like to grow vertically is with trellises, and I'll show you the trellises that I've built. Just a really simple trellis out of a garden fence and some tomato stakes. And on my trellis this year, I'm growing a couple types of beans, some cucumbers, and I'm also trying to grow some mini pumpkins and Minnesota midget cantaloupes. Vertical gardening is a great way to maximize your small space. Whether the plants are growing vertically on a trellis or your pots are vertical like a tower planter, it really helps you pack a lot into a small space. Another tip that has helped me is really packing my plants in and being intentional about fertilizing. So on most plants, the recommendation on the back of the package, say like these sunflowers behind me, they're recommended for them to be planted 6 inches apart. But because I have such a small space, I decided to plant them 3 inches apart and sacrifice the larger blooms for more sunflowers. What was the most important thing to me with these sunflowers was the maximum yield. So even on things like peppers and tomatoes, nearly everything I plant a lot closer together than what's recommended, and I just have to be really intentional about watering and fertilizing as they need it, but that's helped me pack more vegetables and produce into my small space. Something else that has helped me is layering my planting. For example, with my tomatoes, when I first started growing them, I had planted kale underneath. So my tomatoes and sunflowers were my larger plants, but underneath I had kale and nasturtiums, and then I had some zinnias tucked in there as well. Underneath my peppers right now, I've planted beets and carrots. Anything I can do to have multiple layers of harvest out of the same space has been really helpful for me. I just try to be careful that the plants I'm planting are not competing. And kale, for example, does really well in lower light situations, so it will work well under any plant that you want to plant it under. My last tip is to extend your season. So this spring was the first time I tried gardening in the spring, and I started all the way back in March. I planted potatoes, carrots, radishes, beets. I also planted peas on my trellis, kale, lettuce, spinach, and cabbage. I planted these things back in March, and so my garden was already started and growing and producing. By April, I was harvesting. So my goal this year is to extend my harvest. I'm not going to stop when we get our first frost. I'm going to plant some frost hardy things like kale and peas and beets and things like that, so that my harvest will continue, not just be during the warmest months of the summer. That way I'll have a larger harvest in my small space. Well, I hope some of these tips are helpful for you, and I hope that they'll help you get a big harvest from your small space. And I hope that you're not discouraged. I hope that you're able to look at your garden and find joy in planting, and that it becomes a space that you're proud to be in, no matter how big or how temporary it may be. Remember that the biggest factor in your garden success is your attitude, so be willing to try and put in the effort, and even a small space can reap a large reward.